The Talk Shop. Call 0891 104 207. SMS 34701.
Good evening and welcome to the Talk Shop with me, Masechaba Mushweshwe, on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. It's a Monday, so we kick off with our talkback session, and tonight we're looking at the nature of power and how it can corrupt, and we'll be asking the question, why does power corrupt? We've got a different talkback session tonight. We have two guests joining us on the line, and we've extended it to an hour so that we can also be able to take all your calls and get your take on the nature of power and how it can corrupt. We'll be joined by Professor Lisiba Tifo, who is head of the Institute for African Renaissance Studies at UNISA, and we'll also be talking to Dr. Sylvester Bongani Maphosa, who is a chief research specialist and head of the Peace and Security Unit at the Africa Institute of South Africa. And then in the second hour of the Talk Shop tonight, we revisit the land issue. We'll be talking to columnist Khaya Dlanga, who has spoken about land being a black and white issue, but not having black and white solutions. So we'll be getting his take on the land issue and what he thinks we need to do as a country in order to accelerate it, in order to move forward, in order to bring it out in the open, because he says that we cannot continue to sweep the land issue under the carpet. Khaya Dlanga, columnist, joining us to talk about the land issue at around 8:05. We have African Affirmations brought to you by the Eskia Institute coming your way as well. And we wrap up the show tonight by talking about cyclones, specifically focusing on Cyclone Irina that lashed KwaZulu-Natal's north coastal areas with high seas and torrential rain. We'll be talking to Mnigeli Ndabambi, who is the General Manager for Operations at the South African Weather Service. That is the nature of the Talk Shop tonight with me, Masechaba Mushweshwe. Let's get right into it. Welcome our guest joining us on our talkback session tonight as we look at power and human nature. I'm sure you've heard the saying, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts? Absolutely. Well, tonight we ask the question, why does power corrupt? Dr. Sylvester Bongani Maphosa joins us on the line. He is the Chief Research Specialist and Head of the Peace and Security Unit at the Africa Institute of South Africa. And we're also joined by Professor Lisiba Tifo, Head of the Institute for African Renaissance Studies at UNISA. Dr. Maphosa, thank you so much for joining us. So welcome.
Oh, thank you.
Professor Tifo, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome onto the Talk Shop.
Greetings to you and to the listeners.
I think let's first of all define what we mean by power. And we all have heard the saying, power corrupts. What exactly do we mean by power?
Well, if I were to start.
Yes, please, sir. Go ahead.
Let's say power is that authority, the right vested in the individual by virtue of office or by virtue of elective mandate or by heredity, that which gives you the right to decide to speak and to act on behalf of the people as per that mandate that they have given you, or as per that right of birth, be it by birth or otherwise, but you still act on behalf of and for the people. Is that authority vested in you? Never mind how it is bestowed on you. Mm-hmm. And as you exercise it, you exercise on behalf of the people, according to the expectation of and in the interest of the people. That's what I understand by power. But as we shall unpack that as we go on.
I like the fact that you immediately bring up the issue of leadership and power. Now, please, let's bring up personalized power and contrast the two. Because when we're talking about leadership power, as you say, it is looking out for the best interests of the people, and no matter how that power has been vested on you. But what about personalized power when one uses power bestowed on them for personal gain?
Yes, there's also personal power, that which the likes of Nelson Mandela have had. They exude that type of power, inherent in them based on the qualities. But there is another type of power, that which what I think you are alluded to, the type of power that is perverse. Because never mind what kind of power you're talking about, it has to be in the interest of and for the benefit of the people, in whatever sphere of life. But it is when people begin to arrogate that power to themselves to the extent that only their interests and the limited few perhaps closest to them, rather than for the good of all. I think one of the leading scholars in philosophy would say, in a sense of utilitarianism, act in such a way that that very action of yours can be universal, and it must serve the greatest good of the greatest number. And I think you have the likes of Nelson Mandela, Nyerere, Martin Luther King Jr., Sr., all of them exhibit personal power, inherent qualities you are born with, but intended to serve the public rather than the self.
Why does power corrupt? That is the question that we're asking tonight in our talkback session, and we'll be taking your calls and SMSs later on.
SAFM, stay with us.
The Talk Shop. Call 0891 104 207. SMS 34701.
This is the Talk Shop with me, Masechaba Moshweshwe, on SAFM 104 to 107. Tonight we're looking at the nature of power and human behavior. We're asking the question, why does power corrupt? We're joined by Dr. Sylvester Bongani Maphosa, Chief Research Specialist and Head of the Peace and Security Unit at the Africa Institute of South Africa. We're also talking to Professor Lisiba Tifo, who is the Head of the Institute for African Renaissance Studies at UNISA. Now, gentlemen, just before the break, we were talking about how there is power that is used for good, and also there is perverse power. How does power that is meant to be for the betterment of society, to be used for the good of the people, become perverse power?
My colleague Professor Lisiba has articulated well, the ambiguous nature of power. That it is both, hard and it is both soft. Now, in terms of power being violent, it is when, we can view power, from as a form of wealth, form of knowledge and violence. Broadly categorizing the forms of power. Each successive kind of power, represents a more flexible kind of power. For instance, violence can be used negatively to punish, and it also can be used, when we see in states how political power is used to marginalize certain groups of societies. And power also seen as wealth, it can be used both negatively and positively. For instance, advancing the livelihoods of people, advancing development projects in communities. And negatively, it is when the actors that hold that power, that wield that power, withhold the financial resources. And knowledge can be used, in both these ways. And additionally, knowledge can be used in a more transformative way to shape the character and the direction of livelihoods in societies. And particularly what we experience as power exists in all relationships. And from a political perspective, any state has power regardless of its particular structural organization, and ultimately that power derives from the subject of the state. In other words, the relationship that states have with their subjects defines and derives that power. And this mainly rests on the subject's obedience to the orders of the rulers. If the subjects do not obey, the leaders have no power, and if the subjects obey, the leaders have power. For instance, if we look at the Arab Spring, it's a disobedience action of the subjects, which withdraws power from those who are elected and are put into power to direct the governance of the citizens. We do have many examples of passive revolutions. For instance, where the citizens have non-violently changed the status quo in terms of the power relations, and that also highlights the iterative nature of power, that it is not a constant. It is currently shifting throughout history. And for instance, nobility early in the 19th century, nobility used wealth just as industrial elites used violence, but the dominant form of power shifted from violence to wealth in terms of industrialization.
Dr. Maposa,
that made those industrial states or industrial actors to be more powerful. And
let me come in, Dr. Maposa. You talk about how the obedience of the people fuels or gives power to the leadership. In what way does that mean? If one is obedient to whatever laws of the land, whether they agree with them or disagree with them, they are giving more power to that particular style or that particular group of leadership of the day?
Yes, when citizens are obedient to the organizational power structures or political power structures of a particular time, they generate more power for the elite.
But in a situation like explain to me that with that kind of analogy, in a situation like Zimbabwe, where you find that the citizenry are not quiet, where you find that there are movements that are trying to agitate for change, and yet it seems that the leadership is getting more and more powerful by the day.
This is an illustration of where the state power is more powerful than the actions of the people, and in terms of coordination, because what keeps a regime, what keeps a relationship in existence is the reciprocal and the nature of the relationship in terms of power between two or more people.
Professor Tifo, let me bring you in and ask again the noble power that you spoke about earlier on and how it's supposed to work for the good of the people. How does it turn into perverse power?
When good men and women keep quiet or acquiesce in the face of rampant corruption, in the face of maltreatment and ill-treatment of their own, out of expediency or convenience, then indeed corruption will prevail and power will be perverted, and the weak and the wretched of the earth will continue to suffer. Evil thrives when good men and women acquiesce or keep quiet. There is no state power enough to withstand the collective will of the people that says enough is enough. Once and for all, united we shall stand, and down we shall bring it. We have seen the Berlin Wall come down when men and women were convinced it was time for it to come down. Same, we have seen Smith saying, not in my lifetime, 10 years down the line, the Zimbabwean government was in charge. So when men and women say it is enough and stand up, pervert power will be overthrown. As we know, evil has the capacity to triumph over evil. Never mind how long it may take, but ultimately it will triumph. But it's when we keep quiet, out of expediency and opportunism, we even go further to support, to justify, right, the perpetuation of evil out of expediency. And that's the sad reality, unfortunately, that the learned, the educated, the intellectuals, at times will acquiesce in order to get minimal benefits, even in the face of the worst atrocities against their own people, while they are supposed to be the light that should lead the nation and pay the price if needs be, as we have seen the likes of our forebears who gave us this democracy today. Men and women who are educated but forgo the benefits and the comfort of their professions and their families.
Okay.
When men and women keep quiet in the face of rot, corruption and evil, indeed it will thrive.
We're talking to Dr. Sylvester Bongani Maposa and Professor Lisiba Tifo. We're talking about the nature of power and human nature, asking why does power corrupt?
The Talk Shop. Call 0891 104 207. SMS 34701.
This is the Talk Shop on SAFM 104 to 107, and I am Masichaba Mushweshwe. On our talkback session tonight, we're looking at the nature of power and asking, why does power corrupt? We're joined by guests Dr. Sylvester Bongani Maphosa, Chief Research Specialist and Head of the Peace and Security Unit at the Africa Institute of South Africa. We're also joined by Professor Lisiba Tefo, Head of the Institute for African Renaissance Studies at UNISA. And we are taking your calls, asking you, what's your take on the issue? We're talking about power. 0891 104 207, 0891 104 207, or SMS 34701. SMS number is 34701, and SMSs are charged at R2. We're trying to understand the nature of power and how it leads to the corruption that we're seeing. I'm sure you've heard power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've seen some great men in our time, Prof and Doctor, who have succumbed to the headiness of power. Is a leader who exercises perverse power intentionally misleading the people, intentionally distorting power to suit themselves, or is it all based on good intentions that go wrong somewhere? Professor Tefo?
Well, look, we have got one fellow who was an inspiration. At times his voice was messianic when we were at the university, called Robert Mugabe, a man who had 7 degrees. And he was an inspiration to almost all the people I can remember in the 80s and in the early 90s. But things went wrong when he didn't know when to leave office. Mm-hmm. When you do not know when to leave office, which is the greatest sin of African leaders in particular, because you associate political office with self-enrichment, accumulation of wealth for yourself and the many others. And by the time when you think of leaving, you've got so much harm that there is no way you can be left without atoning for your sins, lest you go and die in exile. We have had Mobutu, we have had many examples to that effect. It's when they do not know when to leave, and they start with good intentions, by the way. You were in Sewani, I think 82 or 84, when he assumed office. He promised all and sundry that I'm going for 1 term. Today is 30 years. Mm-hmm. One day in Senegal, promised all and sundry, and even put it in the constitution, only 2 terms. Today, the rest is history. We know what is happening. Mm-hmm. You see, now why is it so? Because it's when you walk in, it's no longer about the people. With time, it becomes about yourself and even perhaps the family, and trying to perpetuate your rule after your death by getting your children under the cloak of democracy to assume the mantle of leadership. But people are no idiots. They can at least bear the yoke of suffering for some time, but one day we've seen it, not only in South Africa, not only in the north of Africa, in many other parts of the world. At one time they will rise and say, enough is enough. We take our destiny in our hands. Never mind the consequences.
I want to understand, is it always about material gain? Does power get distorted because of material gain? We are taking your calls, by the way. Join our conversation with Dr. Maphosa and Professor Tefo on 0891 104 207, 0891 104 207, or SMS 34701, and SMSs are charged at R2. Bashir in Lenasia, good evening to you and welcome.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Hi, yes. Bashir.
Hi. Yes, I agree with your 2 guests over there. However, I think we should extend this topic of power not only between individuals and the state, but also between states. I'm thinking now about the United Nations. Mm-hmm. All states agree, most states agree that, the United Nations is not really well managed, that there has to be a change. And yet, many powerful states belongs to the United Nations, and yet there isn't any change. Everybody talks about it, but it would appear that many states, South Africa included, is reluctant to really initiate change or to talk about change or to change the power dynamics of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And that interests me because, now we're not simply talking about a powerful government or a powerful charismatic figure and, people at grassroots level who have no arms and so forth. Mm-hmm. But we're talking now about powerful states people who represent millions and millions of people who know that their citizens are unhappy with the United Nations, and yet they would sort of back down from genuine change. How would your two guests explain that?
Nice one. Thank you so much. Bashir in Lenasia. Let me take Professor Ntuli in Johannesburg as well. Prof, good evening to you.
Hi, good evening, Mashaba. Good evening to the learned doctor and my friendly professor.
Dumela Ntate.
Da. Yeah. Yeah, I was saying that the issue of power and corruption starts with the issue of self-esteem. If you respect yourself and you have integrity, then you are going to avoid getting into this. But the principal issue here in Africa is that if you do not follow your own roots, your own kind of cultural roots, your traditions, and then you become a photocopy of somebody else, then you are going to be forced up into the end to distort the system that you do not actually understand. Briefly, when you come into a village traditionally and people do not know you and you stay there for about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, what the people do, they give you a cow and give you a plot of land. What do you call that today? That is a jump start. That is an interest-free loan, so that there's going to be balance and peace. Nobody gets richer than the others. Mm-hmm. Because we have moved totally away from that, we find ourselves now confronted by naked power, where people are elected into power in order to distribute those resources for others. Even like Mugabe, when he wanted to leave, it is his own people and his own generals who are saying to him, don't leave, because if you leave, we are going to starve.
What brought about the change? And I love the example that you use, Prof, in terms of what would happen in ancient tradition. But what has brought about that change, where we now look at me, and how this system or this particular position will benefit me? We're now joined by a third professor. I'm going to engage Professor Ntuli quickly after this particular break and let him go. We are still taking your calls on 0891 104 207, 0891 104 207, or SMS us on 34701. SMSs are charged at R2 and join our conversation.
South Africa's news and information leader. SAFM is an SABC radio station.
The Talk Shop. Call 0891 104 207. SMS 34701.
And remember, SMSs are charged at R2. This is The Talk Shop with me, Masachaba Mushweshwe, on SAFM 104 to 107. We're asking the question, why does power corrupt? We're joined by Dr. Sylvester Bongani Maphosa, Chief Research Specialist and Head of the Peace and Security Unit at the Africa Institute of South Africa, and Professor Lisiba Tifo, Head of the Institute for African Renaissance Studies at UNISA. And joining us on the line is Professor Ntuli, who called in and who we happened to detain just to get clarity with regards to where the change occurred. Professor Ntuli, you spoke earlier on about a communal system that worked for everyone, that looked out for everyone and ensured that everyone had resources equally. Now, the question has to be asked, where did things change? When did the nature of people want to acquire and keep things for themselves, as opposed to ensuring that we all have something and we're not going to be going needy or even going hungry?
Yeah, well, what happened, when colonialism as well as apartheid, came in and they began defining us, and once we accepted that definition imposed on you by somebody else, your value systems, your belief systems, and your sense of right and your sense of wrong has already been appropriated. And that's exactly what has happened to us, and we do not know. We are talking here about power corrupting, and I think it's also authority, corrupting. The people we think have got power don't have power; they've got authority, which is power that we are given by somebody else. But power is something that you have within yourself that can make you resist what it is. So we've got a number of people then who cannot define themselves, and therefore are prey to manipulating the systems and corrupting other people and corrupting the system.
Professor Ntuli, thank you very, very much for calling in, sir. And we look forward to hearing from you as well. Give us your take. Join our conversation as we talk about the nature of power and the nature of human nature. And we're talking to Dr. Bongani Maphosa and Professor Lisiba Tefo. Just the one question that was asked earlier on, Bashir in Lenasia says, let's look at nations as opposed to the state and individuals. He says, what about powerful nations that refuse to bring about change? How does one then understand the nature of that relationship and the power dynamics?
Yeah, what is the state, right? And who is leading the state? A conglomeration of individuals derived from the society. The very essence of man, part of which is the love for power. And nothing wrong with power. It is supposed to be there. We need to be led to administer and so on. But it is when that power is no longer serving the interest of the people. Like in the instance spoke about, the very nations are led by men and women who say the interests of our states will supersede the interests of all other states, and all other states shall be subservient to our state and serve our interest. And that's when now the dynamics of state power via other states' power becomes crucial and become also perverted. That in the interest of oil that should serve my state, I will do everything and anything, including eliminating anybody who would make it difficult for me to access that oil, even if it is on his own mother or fatherland. And I think that's what Abir was alluding to. Now, if you look at the United Nations or the African Union, all of them are manned by men and women. They are controlling them, but they always, overtly or covertly, try to get the interests of their own nations first served before the interests of the universe can be served. While the founding mandate was that we found this organization to serve humanity, regardless of color or creed or geography. But what happens? The essence of man begins to supersede and subvert the very interests, the noble interests that were the founding values and principles of an organization. I think he was right. He is right. Those are the challenges we are faced with, and we shall continue to be faced with. But let's not deny that at the heart of it is the material interest and is the material benefit for an individual or for a collective, for a group or for a state.
But just going and sticking with Bashir's point, let me bring you in, Dr. Maphosa, and ask, but what about nations that want to bring about change? What about states that want to bring about change for the good of humanity, for the good of mankind? What happens in such a setting as the UN?
Power shapes preferences via values and the norms and the ideologies. And it is these ideologies that inform policy, that inform policy making. And in that organ of the United Nations, that relationship of states, levels of power exist in terms of shaping the values of the United Nations and the norms and the behavior of individual states that make up the United Nations. And so it is not easy for states that are relatively weaker in terms of power defined through wealth that the states contribute to the United Nations to dictate pace. And it is the essence of that relationship from an international relations perspective that there is a bigger actor and a smaller actor, and that relationship perpetuates itself through the policy that guides the behavior, that guides the values of the relationships. And look at a smaller scale from when power becomes pervasive, when it becomes violent, and when it corrupts those who hold that power, it is characterized in dictatorships, in authoritarian systems, and this is when policy is distorted and does not reflect the concerns that affect the people. And this reduces accountability, legislative accountability, and it distorts also representation in policy making. And this allows the authoritarian states to perpetuate a hold on power. But however, as I've mentioned, as power shapes the preferences in terms of the values that guide the norms and the ideologies.
But who defines who is a dictator? I mean, we've seen situations where you find one is labeled a dictator, one is labeled an authoritarian, and yet when you look at the policies, they are in the best interests of the people. You'll find that education is for all in that particular country, housing is for all, unemployment is almost at zero. So how does one then decide who is a dictator and who is not? Professor Tefo?
Look, it will vary. The definition of dictatorship obviously is likely to be fluid, especially the way you present it, because you would say undoubtedly there was resoluteness to get rid of Saddam Hussein and to get access to oil. At that point, George Bush became the dictator. He was impervious to any positive influence outside and within his own state. There was a mandate, there was a decision, there was determination that we are going there and we shall achieve that. In that regard, there's also another form of dictatorship. But then you see, there is that other dictatorship also, where men start on with goodwill, and with time they immerse themselves in rot to a point where they can no longer to the good that gave them, at least that led them into the house. Now they use all means possible to remain in office or to remain in power. And we are beginning to see signs of that even in the current democratic dispensation in South Africa. It starts with attempts to manipulate and to control state institutions and state organs, which at the beginning, the very dictators themselves would have at least fought for, founded, and defended. And then with time, when they begin to be an inconvenience to them, they begin to use a different language, if you like. Then you can refer to Animal Farm or George Orwell. Now they begin to say, yes, yesterday it was fine, but let's accept that today it is not fine because we are in office, we are in charge. Dictatorship is an evolution of the human mind, the human conduct, to a point where it is failing, or it is no longer accepted, or at least justified to remain in office, to continue with the mandate originally bestowed upon it, for it has betrayed it. By then, you use all means, often state institutions and state organs, to stay in power. That's why, therefore, then the police would be now become brutal, and you turn that into a police state. The army, everybody feels almost the state is militarized. Then you get Chapter 9 institutions. You get men and women to serve on them. If only they are going to serve the interests of the ruling party, no longer of the nation. That's how gradually dictatorship sets in. And at one point you realize you can no longer do much. You have to stay in power at all costs. And then you become impervious to positive influence.
I'm looking at some of the SMSs coming in from our listeners. Tabiso Zulu says, the problem starts when those who are in leadership confuse their positions of responsibility with those of power. And Pumi says, where accountability is absent, power will always corrupt. Look no further than our beautiful continent. Accountability is foreign. Definitely we'll come back to that one. Another SMS says, power is me, power is you, power should be us, power to the good, power to the people. And another SMS, this one says, power dynamism paradigm has been shifted by people like Malema through bravery and less knowledge. I want to come back to that particular one because this is another issue that constantly comes up when we're talking about power and where we are as a country, especially when we're talking corruption in our country and the various initiatives that have been put in place that are not seeming to be winning the war against corruption. Another SMS says power is lost or misdirected when the initial purpose of attaining it I've lost that SMS. When the initial purpose of attaining it, that is the goal. I think the SMS says, it talks about the goal is misplaced. So those are some of the SMSs coming in from you. We are taking your calls, 0891 104 207. You can dial in like Naeem in Mayfair. Hi, Naeem.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Greetings to you and your guests. Three aspects. Firstly, there are many dimensions of power. Wealth is a form of power which is particularly relevant to our political system in this country. Intellectual knowledge is also, and in today's context, control of technology and intellectual property rights. Mm-hmm. And what the powerful tend to do is they develop systems that will protect their power. So, in terms of wealth, you have property rights and all of that. In terms of knowledge, you have intellectual property rights. In terms of political power, you have a legal system. All these are drafted to ensure that those that are in power, that are in control of the legislation, the United Nations is a typical example, that the systems that they establish are there to perpetuate and ensure that their power remains unchallenged. Second aspect, the power is... let me come to another aspect. How do it's a natural tendency of man to want to accumulate more power. What is the solution? Mm-hmm. One is sort of institutions like a legal system, like courts, like law, laws and so forth. But these are also can be corrupted. We've seen in apartheid South Africa, the legal system was totally corrupted. Mm-hmm. Even today in international world, no prosecution for torture, the Iraq War and so forth. Most of the European countries were complicit in the rendition, but the whole the legal system is actually corrupted to ensure that there's no prosecution. So, these the legal system and other Chapter 9 institutions and so forth are safeguards, but we need more than that. And this is where an internal dynamic needs to come into play, a value system, a philosophy, a religion. Buddhism, for example, will espouse negation of power, negation of the world, that type of a remedy to one's ego, to curb one's ego. Islam has also a solution. Mm-hmm. The daily call to prayer, the chant that is most frequently recited is God is the greatest, God is the greatest, which is actually a reminder to mankind that, don't get swayed by your own strength or power or dominance. Always keep in mind that there's a superior power above you that will take you to task for your actions.
Naeem, I think if we were to look at the religions of the world, we would find that a lot of them actually talk about a power higher than us. They talk about the need to serve, as opposed to Christianity talks about Jesus who came to serve, not necessarily to lord himself over everyone. And it ties in with an SMS that came in earlier on that answered our question when we said, why does power corrupt? And the SMS said it did not corrupt Jesus. Just using that as an example of how the different religions of the world will talk about the need to serve, that a leader is about serving others. But when is it the nature of man to want to accumulate more power? Professor Tifo, is it every man who wants to accumulate more power? And does this say that there's something evil in men? And why do some men who are in leadership positions not want to accumulate more power? Why is it that some leaders will step down when their term comes to an end?
Well, we have said a lot about greed. But we must also accept, there are scholarly interventions that I also appreciate here. Knowledge is power. Mm-hmm. We are living in a knowledge economy. Mm-hmm. So you can't make a good leader today. It doesn't matter what you say, unless you are relatively well-schooled. That's a reality. Because men and women who are leading successful countries have had a deeper, at least, insight into their books and into the systems that are running the world, economics and otherwise. So now you say, acquisition of power, if it's justified and legitimate, be it through knowledge or through your own wealth that you legitimately acquire, so be it. There is nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. But it's political power that thrives at the expense of the interests of the people. That I think is there at the heart of the debate, and not only this one, and many other similar debates, that says there is a loss of the original objective. We are deviating as inform the formation or the founding of a particular state.
Professor Tifo, just quickly, sir, we lost you there. You were saying that we're deviating from?
The founding principles, norms, and values of either an organization or a state.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. When we form a state, we have got a vision, we have got a reason. But in the course of time, either we live up to it, or we move away from it, desert it, or even denounce it. And that's why you find even today in South Africa, we are beginning to have a sense, a tension between the state and civil society. For civil society says, you are beginning to drift away from the founding mandate, values and norms of our forefathers who, prior to 1994, said this is a sacrosanct document that will guide us and lead us. Well, then others talk about religion. Well and good, but they must also not forget the worst wars ever fought under the sun were religious wars.
Mm-hmm.
So much as there are norms and values derived from religion, and I'm saying religion and not Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
it's just one of those, right? Indeed, in the search for solutions, which is partly what I think you are also aiming at, let's also invoke our own religions, indigenous knowledge system, and see how best if we're to embrace them. They will at least nurture, revitalize, and reawaken that public spirit, the civil in the leadership. You know, you talk about civil society, the civil in the people, to say that comes first. Service before the self.
Mm-hmm.
And if you begin to rationalize things along those lines, then it is more likely we can weaken and attenuate the pain that humanity is going through simply because of greed, simply because or the states want to get more for themselves rather than more for the people they are supposed to be leading and serving.
Dr. Maposa, let me bring you in. Professor Tifo spoke about the need for education if one is to be an effective leader, if one is to be a good leader. What's your take on that one? Do you agree?
Yes, it is very important to nurture a well-educated citizenry, particularly as education helps to nurture confidence building mechanisms in relationships, because citizens need to have confidence in the leadership, and also leadership need to have confidence in the citizens. It is also important, particularly in contemporary South Africa. On Friday's paper, there was a very important article which documented the shortage of skills, particularly research expertise amongst the South Africans.
Mm-hmm.
So, this also impacts on the ways through which we inform policy decision and policy making. And so education and providing skills and providing expertise to the citizens is one important way through which we can break these barriers that hinder positive use of power.
When we talk about it, yes, sir. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yes, and this education is, both horizontal and vertical, and it should be iterative, and it should not be looked as a top-down kind of education. But both those who are in leadership need to be educated in leadership, particularly in serving the communities and being able to provide the functions that a state need to provide to build secure and provide an enabling condition for human security.
I want to talk about the ability of power to corrupt, it being unique to the African continent, something that Pumi alluded to earlier on in an SMS. I'll come back to that particular point immediately after I take with Sibusiso in Newcastle. Hi, Sibusiso. Good evening, Sibusiso. Sibusiso, hi.
Hi.
Good evening, sir.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Sibusiso? Okay, I'm not sure what is happening with Sibusiso's line there. An SMS came in from Upumi who said, where accountability is absent, power will always corrupt. Look no further than our beautiful continent. Accountability is foreign. When we talk about the corruption of leaders, when we talk about power corrupting, the African continent constantly comes up. Are we the epitome of where corruption is taking place, Professor Defo?
Not quite, but let's go back to the first before I deal with this one. The first one that says accountability. People must be accountable, but civil society must also be prepared to hold them accountable, and if needs be prepared to pay the price in order to force the leadership to be accountable. So there is a reciprocal responsibility on the citizenry and leadership to ensure that the mandate is upheld as per the original decision, vision, norms and values that at the time drove us, including going into exile, fighting and coming back. Ensure that we remain loyal to those. That's fine. Now, when we talk about
before we talk about the continent, when you say that accountability is key, but we ourselves as the citizenry use the argument, but they are leaders. It is okay. This is a president. A president is allowed to do this, even though, according to normal people's, according to the people on the ground's definition, it is wrong. It seems that we give allowances for leaders. We give allowances for those in power.
No. It is not like that. It is not like that. You see, when good men and women keep quiet in the face of rot, then rot will prevail and will reign supreme. Because you're saying to yourself, we as a citizenry, as civil society, we know what our rights are, and we know what mandate we have given you. We know what the Constitution allows us to do. And once you violate that, we stand up to say, no, not in our name and on our behalf, and not in our country.
But
and
Professor Defo, not always, because what happens is we say things like, when we talk about corruption and the misuse and maladministration of money, we say things like, but the apartheid government used more money. The apartheid government was not accountable. We don't know how much they stole from the coffers of the state. So this is nothing compared to that. When we talk about the indiscretions of Bill Clinton when he was president, it was said, but he is a president. I mean, he did not threaten a nation. All he did was have an extramarital affair. He is the president. He is allowed. When Richard Nixon was involved in the various nefarious activities that he was involved in, it was said that he is a president. He is allowed. It is for the good of the nation.
No. I think society stood up to denounce and to renounce. But you must not forget, in our midst, there will always be those, for good or for bad, defend even what we know is evil and is clearly wrong. And the worst thing is when those people lose power and now want us to believe and to convince us that it is now wrong to embrace certain things that they themselves denounced when it was politically expedient. Look, we are at different levels of evolution and development, but you cannot deny that in the West, and perhaps even in Botswana, political leaders are held more accountable than in many other countries. What we're trying to do now is to say, as early as we are beginning to see wrong signs that may lead to the demise of the country, they are beginning to make noise. What are they saying? We want to hold. It's too late. And we shall hold to the court, increase the Constitution.
Professor Defo's line is absolutely... Professor Defo, you're breaking up terribly, sir, there. I'm going to move on to Dr. Maposa, who has been wanting to come in as well on this particular point. Dr. Maposa? Have I lost Dr. Maposa as well? Dr. Maposa?
Hello?
Yes, sir, you're still with us. Yes. You wanted to come in on this particular issue of citizenry.
Yes. In fact, it is a misnomer to associate corruption with Africa. Political corruption is a global problem. For example, recently, a former House of Republican Majority Whip in the United States, Tom DeLay, was convicted and sentenced for money laundering and conspiracy to commit money laundering. And my view, however, is that political corruption becomes more problematic for developing countries, because developing countries are trying to stand on their fragile political and social feet, and so political corruption, breaks the fledgling democracy. It breaks the weak legs through which the developing countries are trying to stand. And comparing the developed countries and the developing countries of Africa, we have corruption there in the United States, but its impact is not so severe as here. In Africa, most states, have weak health infrastructure, they have weak education infrastructure. You look at the road, industrial infrastructure, and currently we have a problem of unemployment, and so political corruption, increases and exacerbates these problems, and that is why the problem of corruption becomes so injurious, 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 becomes so